He was written as a deep-dyed, snarling villain, and he bored the out of me, because there is no longevity in deep-dyed, snarling villainy. And already I started to plan what I was going to do about that. Irwin not only allowed me to do that, but one day said, "Do more." And I did. And the rest, as we say, is history.
When June Lockhart died in her sleep at her Santa Monica home on October 23rd, 2025, at the age of 100, she took with her one of the last direct links to a television show that most people think they already understand. Lost in Space is remembered today as campy, colorful, slightly ridiculous 1960 science fiction. A robot waving its arms, a scheming stowaway, a family that never quite made a home. What most fans never figured out is that almost none of that was a plan. The show that actually aired was a product of a quiet power struggle, a network gamble, and a handful of people who spent 3 years watching their careers get rewritten in front of them, sometimes literally. Lockhart played Maureen Robinson, the family's biochemist mother, from 1965 to 1968. By the time of her death, only 3 of the original Robinson children remained. Bill Mumy, who played Will, Angela Cartwright, who played Penny, and Marta Kristen, who played Judy. Between them, they represent roughly 200 years of memory about a production that never had a proper ending and never got a proper goodbye. Lockhart herself said in later interviews that she learned the show had been canceled not from a phone call or studio meeting, but from a small item in her morning newspaper. That detail alone tells you almost everything about how CBS treated the people who had spent 3 years building one of its most talked about programs. The story of how Lost in Space actually became what audiences remember starts more than a year before the first episode aired, with a film Irwin Allen believed was the finest work he would ever produce. In late 1964, Allen shot a 60-minute pilot called No Place to Hide on a budget that made it the most expensive television pilot filmed up to that point. The people behind the camera were serious professionals, an Oscar-winning cinematographer, a special effects team that would go on to win its own Academy Award, and a writer who later contributed scripts to Star Trek. The story Allen told was equally serious. A family of scientists, the Robinsons, is thrown off course en route to Alpha Centauri and forced to survive on an unknown planet using intelligence, training, and cooperation. There was no comic villain. There was no robot causing chaos for laughs. It played like genuine science fiction drama, closer in spirit to a survival film than a Saturday morning adventure. CBS executives loved it, but not in the way Allen expected. They bought the series immediately and then handed him a list of changes. The pilot, they said, was too dependent on hardware and too short on ongoing conflict. They wanted a villain who could manufacture tension week after week without requiring a new external threat every episode. Allen reportedly floated Ming the Merciless as a model. His writing team pushed for something closer to a Long John Silver figure. What they settled on was Dr. Zachary Smith, and CBS also insisted on adding a robot to the cast of characters. The ship was redesigned. The tone was rebuilt around comedy and menace instead of survival and science, and the original, serious pilot was shelved. Roughly 80% of that unused footage was later cut apart and folded into the first 5 episodes of Season 1, with Smith and the robot written as having stayed behind on the ship to explain why they were absent from scenes filmed almost a year before either character existed. Few fans who grew up watching those early episodes realized they were looking at leftovers from an entirely different show. The character CBS demanded, Dr. Smith, was handed to an actor named Jonathan Harris. And what Harris did with the role is arguably the single biggest reason Lost in Space became what it became. Harris was born in the Bronx to Russian immigrant parents and reinvented himself almost from scratch, changing his surname at 17 against his father's objections, and building a career in theater and television that eventually included more than 100 stage productions. When Allen offered him Dr. Smith, the character on the page was a cold, calculating saboteur who murders a security guard in the pilot and reprograms a robot to kill the Robinson family in their sleep, a role written to be eliminated within the first handful of episodes. Harris recognized immediately that a character designed to die early was not a career, and he began quietly rewriting his own material, arriving on set with new pages he had drafted overnight and steering scenes, so that the comedy and consequence kept circling back to Smith. The insults that became the character's trademark, the theatrical cowardice, the running feud with the robot, Almost none of it existed in the original scripts. It was constructed night after night by an actor determined not to be written out of his own show. It worked. Fan mail for Dr. Smith reportedly reached the thousands per month within the first season, and Allen, whatever his private feelings, had no real choice but to lean into it. Harris eventually negotiated a special guest star credit that appeared on every episode of the series, an arrangement that was unusual for American television at the time. But every gain for Harris's character came at the direct expense of someone else's role, and the actor who paid the price was the one CBS had originally built the entire show around. Guy Williams arrived on Lost in Space already famous, having spent 4 years as a title character in Disney's Zorro. He was cast as John Robinson, the family's commanding officer, and the character the original pilot had centered on. As Dr. Smith's storylines expanded across the first and second seasons, Williams' screen time contracted in almost the same proportion. Cast members who lived through it, including Mark Goddard, later described production that had visibly reoriented itself around Harris, the robot, and Bill Mumies Will Robinson, leaving Williams with little more than a handful of lines in some episodes. Even Harris himself acknowledged, years afterward, how difficult that must have been for a performer who had been hired to lead the series and ended up on its margins. Williams' career after Lost in Space never fully recovered in the United States, but in Argentina, where reruns of Zorro had made him a genuine cultural figure, he was treated as something close to royalty for the rest of his life. He spent his final 2 decades living largely in Buenos Aires. In May 1989, after friends reported that they had not heard from him, police found him alone in his apartment. A ruptured brain aneurysm had killed him roughly a week earlier, at the age of 65, in an era before mobile phones made that kind of isolation less likely. Bill Mumy said afterward that once the show ended, he never saw Williams again. While Williams' role was shrinking in front of the cameras, another member of the production was enduring something far more physically dangerous almost entirely out of sight. Bob May, the actor inside the robot suit, arrived at his audition by accident, having originally come to the studio for a different job. The costume weighed close to 200 pounds in trap heat, so effectively that May compared performing in it to sitting in a sauna. He is reported to have lost consciousness inside the suit on at least 2 occasions during the show's run from lack of ventilation. Despite physically performing every gesture that made the robot one of the most recognizable characters on 1960s television, May never received on-screen credit during the original broadcast run, a fact that quietly reduced both his pay and his long-term residual income as the show grew into a licensing phenomenon over the following decades. He spent his final years as one of the most generous presences on the science fiction convention circuit, reportedly staying at autograph tables until every fan waiting in line had been seen. He died of congestive heart failure in January 2009, not long after a wildfire destroyed the mobile home he shared with his wife in the San Fernando Valley. Lost in Space's most famous rivalry with Star Trek is also the most misunderstood part of its legacy, because the 2 shows are remembered in almost inverted proportion to how they actually performed. Lost in Space consistently ranked in the low 30s in the weekly Nielsen ratings during its run. Star Trek, which is remembered today as the more culturally significant series, never came close to that position, typically landing around 50th place. The rivalry began even before either show existed. Gene Roddenberry pitched Star Trek to CBS first, and the network's detailed questions about its production plans reportedly reflected the fact that CBS was already developing Lost in Space and had no interest in a second competing science fiction series. Roddenberry took the concept to NBC instead, and for 3 seasons the 2 productions competed for the same audience without ever sharing a time slot. The strangest crossover between the 2 shows happened almost by accident. During Lost in Space's 3rd season, the makeup department needed pointed ears for an alien character, and, pressed for both time and budget, borrowed the actual molds used to create Spock's ears on the Star Trek set, repainting them for their own use. Star Trek fans who noticed accused a rival show of copying Spock outright, when the real explanation was that makeup artists on both productions were friends who regularly shared supplies to meet impossible deadlines. There was also a quieter connection running through the cast itself. Angela Cartwright was 13 and Bill Mumy was 10 when filming began, and they effectively grew up together on the Lost in Space set, tutored side by side at the studio school, and working alongside each other for 3 full seasons. Mumi has said in interviews that the two of them were each other's first serious relationship, and that they dated and were briefly engaged in the early 1970s before amicably going their separate ways. What outlasted the romance was a friendship. More than 50 years later, the two of them, along with Marta Kristen, still appear together at conventions and were photographed together as recently as March 2026. At the same time Mumi was filming Lost in Space by day, he was reportedly a devoted Star Trek viewer by night, a fact he later made official by appearing as a doomed Starfleet officer in an episode of Star Trek, Deep Space Nine decades later. Lost in Space never received a real ending. 83 episodes into a run that started strong and gradually lost creative direction, CBS offered a fourth season with a reduced budget, and Irwin Allen declined the terms. The network announced a cancellation on February 19, 1968. Lockhart read about it in the newspaper. Marta Kristen learned by phone call and later described herself as speechless. Bill Mumi has said he cried. There was no rap party and no formal farewell from a network that had built a hit show around these people. The final episode filmed left the Robinson family still stranded, still believing a rescue was only weeks away. The clearest symbol of how far the show had drifted from its serious origins is an episode from its final season called The Great Vegetable Rebellion, in which Dr. Smith is put on trial by a sentient plant and turned into a stalk of celery, opposed by a villain played by an actor in a full carrot costume. Cast members reportedly could barely get through their scenes without laughing, and Irwin Allen was serious enough about it that he wrote two of them out of the following episodes as a penalty. And yet, decades later, when TV Guide ranked 100 greatest television episodes of all time in 1997, that vegetable costume episode placed higher on the list than The City on the Edge of Forever, widely regarded as the best hour of Star Trek ever produced, a reminder that television's judgment of its own history rarely follows logic. What survived all of this was not the show's reputation for seriousness, since it never really had one after that first shelved pilot. What survived was the cast. Jonathan Harris spent decades afterward as a respected voice actor, including a role in Pixar's A Bug's Life, and turned down a brief cameo in the 1998 Lost in Space film. Lost in Space, 1965. Cast reveals what most fans never figured out, because, at 83, he had never played a bit part and had no intention of starting. He died in November 2002, 3 days before his 88th birthday.